She can be funny, she can be good company, but she very much relies on throwaway lines, quite provocative throwaway lines. She's quite difficult to have a detailed, thoughtful conversation with. It's almost as though there's a sort of attention deficit disorder. Very, very quick throwaway comments, which are quite radical, quite provocative. The things that really matter require quite thoughtful, complicated, long conversations where you're learning all the time what you got wrong. But what we're lacking, and I think Liz Truss is almost the most sort of extreme example of this, is the time for thoughtful, nuanced conversations which admit we could be wrong.
Rory Stewart, hello. How's it going?
Nice to see you again. How are you? Good to see you.
Yes, very well. Thank you very much. It's been an eventful week in British politics, but then when have we not been able to say that in recent years? Your reaction to Liz Truss's mini-budgets, the fall of the pound and the resulting statement from the IMF?
I think it's a terrible humiliation. I mean, we haven't seen budgets go this badly wrong so quickly before. I think it feels to me like a sort of triumph of a kind of mad ideology. It reminds me a little bit like the sort of end of communism. As things began to go worse and worse in the 1980s, people went for more and more extreme versions. The theory is always, nothing wrong with the theory, we just aren't doing it properly. So this idea that somehow if you simply cut taxes, deregulate, you're going to generate miraculous growth has become sort of more and more deeply imbued. And the other conservative tradition, which I think brought people like me who are more on the centre-left of the Conservative Party in, which was an idea of fiscal responsibility, not spending money that you don't have, trying to balance your budget, not bankrupting the country, etc., seems to have gone out of the window.
Yeah, Janan Ganesh wrote that column for the FT yesterday, didn't he? Where he said that British politicians for successive generations have made the mistake of mistaking Britain for America, and that without access to this huge market of millions of people and unfettered resources, deregulating doesn't really make much sense. Reaganism without the dollar, essentially. And of course, as well, we did used to have access to a market of millions of people, but we quite recently left it. And in fact, the Chancellor of the Exchequer voted to leave it himself.
Yeah, well, there's been a really lovely article about this, which is everything the UK does makes sense if you just imagine it's a country with a $30 trillion GDP and it's got 330 million people. In other words, we're behaving as though we're the United States. The truth is that we are, or were until recently, the fifth largest economy in the world. We're a significant player. We've got bright, educated population. We've got a lot of wealth and infrastructure. But in global terms, we've gone from being in 2005 an economy larger than China to a situation today where the Chinese economy is 7 times larger than ours. And in thinking about growth, we've got to be thoughtful about what the real constraints on growth are. And basically, they're around productivity, they're around education, they're around innovation, they're around infrastructure, and these are long-term things. There's not some simple thing that you do in a budget which suddenly changes the fundamentals of the British economy, which is to compete, we need to make investments over 10, 20 years.
What was Liz Truss like to work with in government? Did anything surprise you about her?
So I worked as a junior minister when Liz Truss was the Secretary of State in the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. She's somebody who I think a little bit like Kwasi Kwarteng, actually. She can be funny, she can be good company, but she very much relies on throwaway lines, quite provocative throwaway lines. She's quite difficult to have a detailed, thoughtful conversation with. It's almost as though there's a sort of attention deficit disorder. And that's true in modern politics in general. I think it's something to do, it's partly, the way in which you cut your own videos, but we create a world of very, very quick throwaway comments, which are quite radical, quite provocative. And she's very suited to that. She's very much a politician, not of Twitter or of Facebook, but of Instagram. She's generated a lot of her political career off images of herself in different costumes in front of different flags. And I think it's one of a problem that goes well beyond Liz Truss or Kwasi Kwarteng to the depth of our politics, which is the things that really matter require quite thoughtful, complicated, long conversations where you're learning all the time what you got wrong. And instead of which, we've got a culture increasingly developed of people who have very strong opinions, which are frequently very popular because you just say, I'm going to cut taxes. Everyone's like, that's great. But what we're lacking, and I think Liz Truss is almost the most sort of extreme example of this, is the time for thoughtful, nuanced conversations which admit we could be wrong.
Just you wait and see what we do with this interview. To you, Rory. We had an old Conservative Prime Minister in Boris Johnson, of whom you were very critical, and now we have a new Conservative Prime Minister, Liz Truss, of whom you were just very critical. So, do you think you can still describe yourself as a Conservative?
Well, I'm not a Conservative in the modern Conservative Party. I was thrown out of the Conservative Party. I'm found increasingly difficult to recognise because, if you look at two big things that I think really mattered in the Conservative tradition have been lost. One is commitment to the environment, landscape, stewarding it, and that was something that even Boris Johnson was a bit better about. Now, Boris Johnson actually, with all his flaws, and I really disliked him, I thought he was a terrible Prime Minister, but he did actually care about conservation of the environment, something that his wife cared about, something his father cared about. It's in his DNA. And it is something that was one part of the Conservative tradition, which was stewardship, is the word we called it, of our landscape, of our environment, of our natural resources. I was very proud as a minister to protect funding for the national parks. 6 years has gone into developing quite a complicated nature-based farming system. And that's one thing which Liz Truss seems to be signalling that she's throwing out of the window in this dash for growth. And the problem with the dash for growth is that really the older Conservative tradition was about saying there are many other things that matter more than just growing the economy as fast as you can. Traditional Conservatives cared about tradition itself, cared about the landscape, the better bits of the Conservative tradition cared about rural communities, cared about society, cared about history, cared about the past. And the problem with a radical drive for growth is it's the modern world at its most radical, everything being churned up all the time, everything changing all the time. That's one thing. Second thing is another bit of the Conservative tradition was about prudence. It was about restraint. It was about not moving too quickly. I mean, the clue was in the word conservatism. You were trying to preserve and protect what was best about the past. And the problem with what we're seeing at the moment is it's a form of radicalism which isn't prudent. It's not careful.
I feel like you're maybe slightly quoting Roger Scruton when you're talking to me there. And that was my follow-up question was going to be, do you think either of those people, Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, can be described as a small c Conservative, or are they Conservative in party only?
Well, so I think that they're not small c Conservatives. They're free market radicals. And for me, conservatism was about love of country, respect for tradition, prudence at home, restraint abroad, and all those things seem to be going out the window.
So what are Liz Truss's politics? Libertarian?
Yes, I think she is libertarian. I think she and Kwasi Kwarteng and a lot of this cabinet and a lot of the people at that end of the Brexit Party are not really, in my sense, traditional Tories. I mean, traditional Tories, as you can imagine, are seen as a bit fuddy-duddy. Criticised us, we think we're a bit out of date, we're living in the past. We're obviously very, have deep kind of nostalgic romantic affections for the monarchy, for the British Army, for the British landscape, for small farmers. This is all part of the story of what an MP like me in the Lake District was about, right? But Liz Truss is somebody who comes from a radical left-wing family. She was a Lib Dem. She was a radical Republican who wanted to abolish the monarchy. She's a radical free marketeer. And so I think it's actually, there's a split on values here about what values really matter and count.
Political predictions are a mug's game, but do you think she'll make it to the next election?
Well, you can see MPs already coming out openly on Twitter criticising her and saying that they made a mistake going with her rather than Rishi Sunak. That's very unusual. Normally people have a honeymoon period. So I would think that she'll be a bit concerned at the moment because it feels very, very fragile. And remember, she didn't get the majority of the MPs. Rishi Sunak got the majority of the MPs. And of course, Rishi Sunak was the guy that was saying that if she did the things that she's going to do, it would cause a run on the pound, it would cause a crisis in the financial markets. And 3 weeks ago, people were seeing him as a kind of sort of prophet of doom, and this guy's completely unrealistic. But exactly. But the point is that he was trying to say, maybe not as much as he should have done, I would have gone further than him, but he was at least trying in those debates to say, there is a reason for being prudent. There's a reason why the Treasury likes to balance the books. There's a reason why we don't cut taxes when we're short of money. There's a reason why we basically try to think about how much money's coming in and how much money's going out. These things are not just fantasies, abstractions. You don't need to worry about them. That in the end, if people think that the country doesn't have a plan, can't pay its debts, that you're going to end up with a situation where the government's putting its foot on the accelerator and the Bank of England's putting its foot on the brake, you end up potentially with what I've been fearing now for 2 years, which is a prolonged recession combined with inflation.
Other political developments this week, the Labour Party conference and Keir Starmer's speech. Did you catch any of it? What did you think?
So I think it's remarkable what he's managed to do. I think it's great to see them singing God Save the King. I don't think it's ever happened at a Labour conference before. And it happened with a lot of dignity, very straightforwardly. There would have been people in the audience who aren't monarchists or Republicans, but it was a sign that Keir Starmer is very comfortable moving into the centre ground of British politics. And I think that's really important because I think the centre ground needs to be rebuilt.
And one of the other, perhaps the biggest developments from the conference floor was that the Labour Party voted to adopt proportional representation as an electoral system. That must have been music to your ears then, really.
I think it's incredibly exciting. And we've got to hold Keir Starmer to proportional representation because the only way of breaking the stranglehold of these two big parties is PR. That's why in Australia, through their single transferable vote system, you get the teal independents, who are people who are conservatives, the sort that I admire, blue and green, care about the environment, care about gender issues, but are also fiscally responsible. That's how Macron comes through in France. That's why Germany has had one of the most stable, productive political systems that we've seen in the last 20 years. Proportional representation encourages compromise, it allows new parties to emerge in the centre ground, and it stops the kind of paralysed, stultifying sense of the Labour and Conservative parties who have eventually been strangling British politics for 70 years.
And perhaps the reason you're so excited is because it means that Rory Stewart can return to British politics.
Well, obviously, I would love to create a new party. I'd love to get energy going again in the centre ground. And I think the way to do that is proportional representation. I discovered running to be Mayor of London how difficult this stuff is. And they've just changed the rules in London, so it's now first past the post. So an independent can't possibly come through anymore. We've got to create more space for, we can come up with ground words like innovation, but basically fresh ideas, new parties, new people, and we'll only get that if we get rid of this first past the post system.
So, 2 years until the next election, 10 years of the next Labour government, and then we've paved the way for Rory Stewart to come back to Parliament.
That's right. By the time I'm 75, I will definitely be back as a junior minister in some future government.
Thanks, Rory. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.